Music and social and/or political commentary have shared the stage time and time again throughout the years, and even if someone isn't initially paying attention to an artist's message they convey through their music, they'll often come to appreciate it more as they become a fan. In the case of punk rock specifically, this type of commentary through songwriting has really become a staple of the genre. However, the subject of women's rights is still oftentimes a little underrepresented. Although I wouldn't say it's a subject that's unwelcome in the world of punk, I don't think I'd be the only person to say the genre has a predominantly male audience, and I think my YouTube analytics are kind of an example of that. All of that being said though, punk has still brought us a number of strong female voices that have each brought their own ideas to the table when it comes to women's rights in punk and in the larger world, but I think most of us can agree that there's one band that left a bigger mark than most, if not all. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today we will be diving into the story of not only one of the most important punk bands of the early 90s, but also one of the most noteworthy feminist bands in history. And that band is none other than Bikini Kill. As I always do, I'll be taking you all through the history of the band, starting off with their humble beginnings in the underground scene of Olympia, Washington, all the way up to their current place in music today, along with discussing the huge mark they left on punk music and culture and on social commentary in general, along with a few of my personal thoughts on their music and impact as well. Before we dive in, I want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite Bikini Kill songs, along with some of the other projects the band members have had over the years. So if you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description below. I also want to shout out my first two Patreon supporters, D-Razzle and The Walking Deadpan. Thank you guys so much for the donations. I started a series of album reviews and commentary on Patreon, and I just did my first episode on Bad Religion's album Suffer, so if you want to check that out, there's a link to that in the description below too. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please consider subscribing to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways! The story of Bikini Kill begins not with the band itself, but actually during the childhood of lead vocalist and mastermind Kathleen Hanna and her discovery of feminism in her pre-teen years through her mother. Kathleen would also draw a lot of her early inspiration from Ms. Magazine, a feminist magazine from the early 70s, and she's recounted on cutting out photos from it to create collage art during her childhood and teens. Kathleen and her mom's passion for women's rights continued to grow as she got older. However, their shared interest did not sit well with her father, unfortunately, and the two of them were forced to keep their dedication to the cause private from him all through her adolescence. After graduating high school, Kathleen began studying photography at the Evergreen State University in Olympia, Washington, and further pursued her passion for women's rights and activism on the side. With the help of a few like-minded friends, she continued creating artwork to spread her message, but the new artwork had a much darker tone to it and touched on serious issues women faced in American society, as opposed to the more girl power theme she'd used in the past. The group hung up their art all throughout the Evergreen State campus, but their work would unfortunately be censored by the college and taken down. In response to this, Kathleen and her friends started a feminist art space in an old garage they called the Reco Muse, and the space quickly became a much more reliable spot for the group to create and display their artwork and message. Kathleen would also start pursuing activism through spoken word and would do performances at various locations throughout Olympia, speaking about similar issues she touched on with her artwork. However, she was later convinced she'd have better luck getting her message out with a band when she spoke to famous writer Kathy Acker, who insisted Kathleen would reach a lot more people that way. So Kathleen had already had a cause and a message for a long time now, but it seems like it wasn't until this point that she'd found the right mode of transportation for it. And it wouldn't be much longer before she would start putting her words to an intense musical backdrop with a few of her friends. The first band Kathleen would put together was actually called Amy Carter and was named after the daughter of former US President Jimmy Carter. The band also included two of Kathleen's friends by the names of Heidi Abergast and Tammy Ray Carland. Info on this Amy Carter band is pretty hard to come by, but I think it's pretty safe to say it was a really short-lived project. However, the band would put on some shows at the Reco Muse Art Gallery, a few of which I believed Nirvana actually joined them for. Following the breakup of the band, Tammy Ray would start a zine called I Heart Amy Carter that was kind of a predecessor to the Riot Grrrl zines I'll talk about a little further into the video, and she she would also remain friends with Kathleen and contributed album art for Bikini Kill further down the line. The breakup of Amy Carter was certainly not about to stop Kathleen from making music though, and she would found the band Viva Knieval shortly after. The band consisted of her on lead vocals along with Zeb Olsen on bass, Zeb's brother Stu Olsen on guitar, and Matt Zodro on drums. Viva Knieval would prove to be a much more promising endeavor than Amy Carter, and along with doing plenty of shows at the Reco Muse Gallery and elsewhere throughout the Pacific Northwest, they would embark on a US tour sometime between the years of 1989 and 1990. Viva Knieval would also release a self-titled 7-inch through Ultrasound Records sometime in 1990, and although it isn't available on streaming, I was able to dig up a rip somebody uploaded to YouTube, and I'll provide a link to that in the description below. Shout out to the channel Nikki Doubledick for uploading. Just like Amy Carter though, information about Viva Knieval is also pretty hard to come by, so if anyone who knew of the band or knew Kathleen back in the early days happens to stumble upon this video, I'd love to know how much of what I was able to dig up here is actually true. So by now, Kathleen's got a decent amount of experience playing in bands and is already getting her message out through the punk rock scene. But when exactly does Bikini Kill come into the picture? Also attending Evergreen State University at the time was a multi-instrumentalist by the name of Toby Vale, who had been hoping to get a band started with her on drums and her friend Kathy Wilcox on bass. Toby had also been running a feminist punk zine by the name of Jigsaw that Kathleen was actually an avid reader of, and it was through this connection that Toby and Kathy were able to recruit Kathleen to be the vocalist for their new band. The band started rehearsing at Toby's parents' house, and after becoming acquainted with one another and putting together a rough, fuzzy punk rock sound, the trio would promptly start searching for a guitarist. Although they'd originally hoped to find a girl guitar player, their search and tryout process proved to be pretty unsuccessful, so the group would instead recruit Toby's friend Billy Karen to play guitar. And once he was on board and up to speed, the band then quickly got to work on building up a set, and it would not be long after that until they started playing shows all the time. The band would get their name from a different feminist punk band started by another musician in the Olympia scene named Lois Maffio, and the name Bikini Kill itself was actually inspired by a 60s spy movie called The Million Eyes of Sumeru. However, Lois Maffio's Bikini Kill would only perform a single one-off show, and she would later move on from the project with a band called Cradle Robbers. Toby Vale, however, found she quite liked the band name, and clearly Kathleen, Billy, and Kathy felt the same way. Once they had a band name, Bikini Kill would put together their first demo in 1991 and titled it Revolution Girl Style Now, and it featured 8 tracks the band had recording during their first year together at Yo-Yo Studios in Olympia, Washington. This release would later be reissued in 2015 through the band's label, and the reissue included 3 previously unreleased tracks, so if you're wondering why the Spotify version has 11 songs instead of 8, there's your answer. But Revolution Girl Style Now would only be the very beginning of Bikini Kill's recordings, and the demo would grab the attention of the newly established DIY label Kill Rock Stars, and the band would release a 6-song EP through that label in October of 1992. The EP included new recordings of 5 songs from the demo tape and 1 brand new track by the name of Thurston Hart's The Who. And interestingly enough, it would also be produced by Ian MacKaye from Fugazi and Minor Threat. Bikini Kill would soon find themselves taking off much faster than they ever could have predicted, and especially with punk really starting to take off all over the West Coast underground scene. And as they continued to play shows throughout the Northwest and the rest of the country, the crowds began to increase dramatically in size. While this was certainly a plus for the band as their music and message were now reaching more people than ever before, violent moshing and fights began to break out far more often at their shows, and many of their female fans would often express concern and frustration about getting hurt or forced to stand in the back. Kathleen and the rest of Bikini Kill felt this contradicted their values, so they began encouraging the girls to stand in the front at their shows and started speaking out against violent behavior while on stage. Kathleen would even encourage girls to come directly to the stage and inform her and the band personally about violence against them happening in the crowd, and she and the band would often kick people out of the shows for being too violent or really creepy. To further promote the band and their message, Kathleen would also start writing a Bikini Kill zine, which also included a lot of her artwork and personal reflections about the band and their message. Copies of the zine would be passed out frequently at their shows and especially during their tours, and I reckon this had a big role in not only exposing people to what Bikini Kill stood for, but also growing their popularity in the punk scene outside of Washington State. However, this would not be the last zine that Kathleen Hanna would be involved with, and she began work on a new one in 1991 with the help of a few of her friends. During their tours of the states, Bikini Kill had found the scene in Washington, D.C. to be particularly receptive to their message. Although although the presence of feminism in the punk world was still fairly scarce, they found the DC scene to be a lot more invested in progressive politics in general, and made the decision to relocate there with fellow Washington feminist punk band Bratmobile. While they were living in DC, Kathleen and Toby, along with Allison Wolfe and Molly Newman from Bratmobile and Jen Smith from the band Rastro, came up with the idea for a new feminist punk zine they called Riot Grrrl. The name actually came from their response to several cases of violence against women that were fresh in the news at the time, and Jen's idea that they needed to respond with a girl riot, as she put it. Toby had also come up with the name Angry Girl with the many R's in it, and the group paired the two together to come up with the name Riot Grrrl. The five of them then quickly got to work on creating flyers and taking them around to shows in the DC area, inviting girls to meet with them about starting a new scene based on the ideas they had for Riot Grrrl. Once the zine started to take off a little more, they then encouraged girls and women all over the country and larger world to take the ideas they'd had and put their own spin on them. And it wouldn't be long until other Riot Grrrl zines began popping up all over. And as I'm sure a lot of you guys probably know, the name would later be repurposed to define the fuzzy, garagey style of feminist punk Bikini Kill pioneered that bands are still playing and developing on to this day. So before we move on, I think it's important to note a few other Riot Grrrl bands we've seen come and go over the years, like Slater-Kinney, 7 Year Bitch, L7, Babes in Toyland, and Emily's Sassy Lime in the 90s era, as well as some more recently established bands like the Coat Hangers and Dream Nails. Riot Grrrl would also develop a presence in the UK through bands like Huggy Bear and Skin Teen, and I would also say that the scene's energy lives on just as well through feminist punk of all varieties to come up after Bikini Kill. For instance, while bands like Bad Cop, Reviver, Torso, and Gloss may not have the Riot Grrrl sound per se, I would say they still fit the title in some way or another simply for their presence as feminist punk rock bands. The Russian band Pussy Riot is also certainly worth a mention here too, and although their music has had a more pop or hip-hop influenced sound for a good while now, they were actually a rad punk band when they first came out, and are definitely an important inclusion when it comes to the conversation of feminist punk overall. But going back to Bikini Kill, the band would follow up their first EP with a split album. They called their side of the split Yeah 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 and debuted 7 brand new tracks, one of which was the first release of the iconic Rebel Girl song. The other half of the split would feature Huggy Bear's Our Troubled Youth, and the album made its first appearance in March of 1993 through Kill Rock Stars. Bikini Kill's side of the album was also later reissued in 2004, but this time with 7 unreleased tracks of theirs recorded at a few different rehearsals and live performances. Huggy Bear's side was not included in the reissue due to problems getting the rights to their music. But Bikini Kill wasn't about to stop there, and although Yeah 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 and especially the Rebel Girl track had proved to be a huge success for their band, they'd also recorded a full-length LP during their sessions for the split album in late 1992. Once mixed and mastered, the album was given the name Pussy Whipped and officially made its debut in late October of 1993. It included 11 brand new tracks along with a crisper recording of Rebel Girl, and the record also features an album cover photographed by Tammy Ray Carland. Its final track is actually titled For Tammy Ray, and as I'm sure you can tell, is dedicated to her. 2 of the album's tracks feature vocals from Toby Vale, and another one features vocals from Kathy Wilcox. And there's a number of old live performances you can actually find on YouTube of the band switching roles to play these songs mid-set. Bikini Kill would then follow up their debut full-length with the 7-inch New Radio later that year, which was actually produced by Joan Jett. This EP includes a crisper recording of Rebel Girl as well as 2 additional tracks by the names of New Radio and Demi-Rep. Although the new record would certainly gain them some fans and a lot of attention in the music scene with punk newly on the rise as of 1991, the band and Kathleen in particular would unfortunately become targets of harsh criticism from journalists, often being the subject of articles that took lyrics way out of context and over-exaggerated things Kathleen or anyone else in the band may have said in songs and or interviews. In response to this, the band chose to refrain from talking to press about anything at all, or what they called a media blackout. They would, however, keep producing the Riot Grrrl zines, and it wouldn't be long until other bands in the scene would start doing the same. They would also continue to record and release new music and dropped 2 7-inch EPs during this period of their career. The first of these was a 4-song 7-inch titled The Anti-Pleasure Dissertation, and the second was a single release called I Like Fucking that came out in October of 1995. The only interview from this time that Kathleen Kathleen appeared in was featured in a short film called No Alternative Girls made by filmmaker Tamra Davis, and it also included several other noteworthy musicians of the era, including Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth and Courtney Love. Although this was technically an interview done during Bikini Kill's media blackout, Kathleen's face doesn't actually appear in the video since she's wearing a ski mask for all of her segments on screen. And I'm not exactly sure if it's due to a fuzzy microphone or actual editing, but there appears to be a static slightly disguising her voice as well. If any of y'all are interested in checking this video out, there's actually a rip of it up on YouTube, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Tamra Davis would also direct the music video for Sonic Youth's song Bull in the Heather, and as I'm sure some of y'all probably know, Kathleen Hanna would appear in the video just to do some chaotic background dancing of sorts. And just for the sake of trivia, she would also introduce Kathleen to Adam Horovitz from the Beastie Boys, and the two of them would end up getting married in 2006. As for Bikini Kill, however, the band found it growing increasingly difficult to function as a group through all of the intense touring and rehearsing they were doing. And Kathleen actually reflected on this during an interview for the Punk Singer documentary, saying, "Our relationship as four people disintegrated because we weren't ever looking at each other and dealing with the problems that each of us had." Kathleen would always find herself in the leadership role for the band too, and at times she didn't always feel very comfortable in it, as she was not only the face of Bikini Kill, but really the entire Riot Grrrl scene as a whole. She would keep receiving all kinds of hateful things in the mail and nasty comments at shows, as well as constantly being asked intrusive questions from the media about things like SA or whether or not she'd worked as a stripper before. This type of intrusive media coverage would come to a peak in 1995 when Courtney Love physically attacked Kathleen backstage at Lollapalooza, and Courtney was charged with assault and forced to pay Kathleen $30,000. There's a few different stories about what actually happened, ranging from Courtney just throwing some little things at Kathleen to her actually coming up and hitting her, but either way, the media of course used this as an excuse to write another run-of-the-mill catfight story that pinned Courtney and Kathleen against one another. Despite the media's efforts to convey a story of an ongoing feud, however, people close to Kathleen recount that her and Courtney didn't even know each other at the time, and Courtney's actions were completely unprovoked. Despite tensions being at an all-time high between the band members and their relationship with the media and public image, Bikini Kill would release one final album by the name of Reject All American in April of 1996. They would then embark on a few final tours in support of the new album, but would officially disband in 1997. After that, Bikini Kill would remain dormant until the late 2010s, with the band members pursuing other projects in the time between their breakup and the reunion. The most notable of these projects are probably Kathleen's band La Tigra, as well as her solo music that she released under the name Julie Ruin, but instead of talking too much about that, I'd much rather focus on the everlasting legacy and huge mark on music Bikini Kill left behind. So I think you could certainly make the argument that feminism has had a presence in punk since the beginning, but I don't think I'd be the only one to say that Bikini Kill took it to a whole new level. And not just to the point where their band got, the whole Riot Grrrl scene in general spawned countless other bands with their own great ideas in music, and I really don't think any of that would have happened if it weren't for Bikini Kill. Like I was getting at earlier, the Riot Grrrl sound, and even more so the ideals, are still very much present in the punk scene these days, and we probably wouldn't have had nearly as many bands over the past 30 or so years since Bikini Kill first came out if they hadn't been there, nor would these ideals have been able to reach as many people as they did. And I think they might have even had a bigger impact when it comes to just encouraging more girls and women to participate in punk rock in general. Well, as a man, I can't speak on this from experience. I have to say, even I can see the fact that they've always done everything they could to encourage female participation and empower girls through their message has clearly gained them a lot of female fans and supporters over the years. And on top of that, I don't think I'd be the only one to say they did a lot when it came to informing and educating all kinds of people in the punk scene about the importance of gender equality, regardless of their personal gender expression or identity. And from a purely musical standpoint, if you're watching this video, I think you'd probably agree that Bikini Kill just made some great fucking songs, and their influence can be heard all over punk rock to this day through all kinds of bands. One of my favorite examples of Bikini Kill's musical impact in more recent years is a garage punk band called Black Wine that Jeff Schroek from the Erg started after their split in 2008. But they're certainly not the only band to take influence from Bikini Kill in some way or another. I would actually argue they had a huge impact on the garage indie punk sound as a whole, and a couple more great bands bands in this realm I can recommend would be Be Your Own Pet and Joyce Manor. They've also definitely left a mark on music outside of punk too, and most notably on indie rock, and in fact some of the band members have even gone on to be in more indie rock style bands after Bikini Kill split up. And as I always do, I'll close off this video with some of my personal thoughts on Bikini Kill. So Bikini Kill has always been one of those bands I've been aware of the significance of and somewhat familiar with the music, but I honestly didn't realize what a wild ride of a story they actually have before I started researching for this video. And having done that now, it really made me aware of just how important they were to both punk and feminism, and especially when it came to tying the two of them together. And like I said, I've always been a fan of their music to an extent, but again, until researching this video, I was very much a casual listener. But after having really sat down with their music now, I can honestly say they have a lot of really fantastic, well-structured songs. And not to mention, I think their music was the perfect method of transportation when it came to getting their message out, especially for the time. Plus, I don't think anyone can deny that Kathleen Hanna is absolutely brilliant, not just when it comes to songwriting, but also in the world of DIY promotion. Those Riot Grrrl zines were huge in not only getting Bikini Kill out there, but tons of other bands with similar ideals. And although she wasn't the only person involved with that, I think it's pretty safe to say she certainly had a leading role in it. And I really don't think things would have gotten as far as they did without her. Well, I think that about sums up our history lesson on Bikini Kill here. Again, thank you so much to D-Razzle and The Walking Deadpan for their support on Patreon. I'll be doing another album commentary video up there in a couple of weeks, this time with Black Flag's Damaged. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are some of your thoughts on Bikini Kill? What are your favorite songs of theirs? Do you think they were as significant to music as I do, or do you disagree? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.